In his State of the Association address, NCAA President Myles Brand warned that college sports must not continue to emulate professional sports. If this movement continues, he said, college sports as we know it will disappear, and with it, the educational value to student athletes and the institutional goodwill and support from alumni and fans. We'll talk with the former president of Indiana University about that and more. Let's take note with Myles Brand, president of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Today's interview was made possible by Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
It has been about a year since you became president of the NCAA, an organization that has been shaping college sports for the past 100 years. Describe, if you would, your first 12 months in office.
Well, my first 12 months in office was a learning experience, at least for the first half of it. Having been a university president and on campuses all my life, of course I knew a lot about athletics, but I knew it from the point of view of the university, not from the point of view of athletic administration, not from the point of view of the national scene, including the networks and other approaches. And so I spent a great deal of that time traveling around and meeting with the leadership amongst coaches, student athletes, and others. And that was very exciting for me, and it was a good learning experience.
Now, there's no lack of issues in the world of college sports. What do you see, though, as the most pressing issues facing college sports today?
I would describe it this way. It seems to me critically important that we put student athletes as the center of all that we do. That's why universities are in the business and why they undertake college sports to begin with. And in order to do that properly, not only do we have to assure that they get an opportunity for a first-class education, but we also have to make sure that the athletic departments are fully integrated, mainstreamed, if you like, into the university proper.
Now, this is a message that you've really been giving long before you were the president of the NCAA. In fact, I read a speech 2001 before the National Press Club where you were emphasizing this academic first and this integration. How tough a sell is this?
I have been talking about these issues for some time, and I think we're making progress. You know, it's not really a tough sell. The faculty members understand it. The athletic directors understand it. The presidents of the universities certainly understand it. And the student athletes are happy with it. I think we have forces external to the university that are pushing us in another direction. But it's not a very tough sell. It's a little more difficult campus by campus to figure out how to implement these changes. But philosophically, there's a great deal of agreement.
In an address before the NCAA, you talked about the collegiate model, which is an education-based model, and compared it with the professional model, which is profit-based, and warned that college sports must not be drawn like a moth to a flame. What are among the, I should say that some will already say that we've already become the professional model, or we're already adopting the professional model. So the question is, how do we get Pandora back in the box?
Well, looking at it this way is really an extension of the earlier point, namely that what you really have to do is reintegrate into collegiate athletics into the university mission and structure. Now, Penn State does it especially well, and indeed it's the poster child for how to do it right, I believe. In Penn State, which I'll use that as a good example, is that the athletic director reports directly to the president, and the athletic director sits in on the president's council. The intramural and club sports reports through the athletic director. The advising takes place in a university-wide system, as does the budgeting. So I think that's the kind of model we want to really generate in other places. Now, what's happened in other schools and other areas is that there's been a steady separation of the athletic department from the rest of the university. In some cases, amongst some Division I-A schools, athletics is a separate 501c3 with its own board of trustees, different from the board of the university, and the president of the university doesn't even know the budget of the athletics department. That's very different from what happens at Penn State, and that's what we want to rein in.
And of course, add to this the fact that on some campuses, presidents feel like glorified fundraisers, and they're replaced as often as college coaches.
Some say the life of a university president is nasty, brutish, and short. But I don't think it all has to do with athletics and fundraising. When I was president of Indiana University, actually fundraising was one of the more enjoyable aspects. Going to the state legislature wasn't always, but certainly working with donors and friends of the university is. I think that's part of the president's job. I don't see that the reason why presidents are turning over. I think we're seeing nationally 4 or 5 years as the average of the president's turnover. It's just because it's a very complex job with multiple constituents, one of which is athletics, but it goes well beyond that.
Now, in recent years, even at the best institutions, there have been a number of high-profile infractions, misbehaving on the part of coaches, athletes, and in some cases, even presidents. How damaging is this, and what's the NCAA doing to act swiftly to change those situations?
It is damaging. It has happened. This particular year, we've seen many kinds of scandalous behavior come to light, be portrayed locally and on national TV. There's a good story here that's often missed. In the vast majority of cases, when the coaches are misbehaving, the presidents have been stepping up and taking action and firing them. So across the country, we've seen presidents, university presidents, saying, this is unacceptable behavior, and we're going to release you, often to the chagrin of the local community, which treat the presidents badly when a favored coach gets fired, but nonetheless the presidents have stood firm. In a couple cases, the presidents themselves have been misbehaving, and in those cases, they have been dismissed. So the tolerance for misbehavior has actually gone down, and we're seeing those people moved on, and that sends a message to everyone else. So while it's true we've had scandalous behavior, the fact of the matter is those folks are no longer around.
Now, the F word is something lots of people heard if they were watching ESPN. A popular basketball coach dropped that word several times in an interview. Is this kind of behavior more common today than it was, say, a decade ago?
Oh, I think we're exposing it more, and our tolerance is less. A number of the coaches in this country have 7-figure compensation packages, and that raises the level of expectation, and the light is shining on them. I've had a well-known basketball coach say to me that I can't go out to a restaurant now and have a glass of wine with my wife. And that comes with the celebrity, and he's right, and this isn't a problem that he regrets, it's just the fact of the matter. And I think it puts all the coaches, not those with those high salaries, on notice that the level of behavior, moral behavior, as well as following the rules, has changed, and they are going to have to adopt. And the good news is that they are. Let me give you a specific example. Right before the basketball season, the National Association of Basketball Coaches, all the Division I basketball coaches, came together as a whole with very few absentees to say, we will be guardians of the game. We will follow the moral rules as well as the NCAA rules as well. And that was a statement. So I think the coaches have got it now.
Well, what do you say to those, though, who complain that athletes and high-profile coaches are held to a different standard? When they misbehave, the same sanctions that might be applied to another student aren't applied to them.
I'm not sure that's true with students. It is true with coaches. Some of the reasons that these high-profile coaches have been fired probably are not the same reasons that a faculty member, certainly not a tenured faculty member, would be fired. They are being held to a higher standard, and I think for those coaches that makes sense. I'm not uncomfortable with that. With respect to student athletes, I don't think that's true. I think we hold all students to the same level. Some of them get arrested for misbehavior, both student athletes and non-student athletes, and they pay the penalty as they should, except only some of them make the newspaper.
A point others have made as well. You say that the NCAA as a whole is changing to be more flexible and less rigid in its approach to its interpretation of rules. Can you give us a concrete example of this reasonableness approach that you've taken?
Yes, the rules are the rules, and we will follow the rules, and if you break the rules, you'll pay the penalty. But sometimes the cases are very complicated and they're borderline cases. And what I've been arguing is that in those cases we should give the student athletes the benefit of the doubt. As I mentioned before, the student athletes are the center of all we can do and all that we should be doing. So to give you an example, we've had some international student athletes. We changed the rules, but the rules were changed in such a way there was about a dozen athletes nationally who were not grandfathered into the old rules. And at our convention just a couple of weeks ago, we said, now wait a second, we're not treating those student athletes fairly. The rules had changed in mid-course. They didn't do anything wrong. Let's not hold them responsible. In the past, we wouldn't have done that. In the past, we would have said, too bad. The fact of the matter is we took into account the feelings and the opportunities for student athletes, and we adjusted. And that was a good sign.
So foreign athletes such as Penn State's Jan Jagla, who I think missed several games because of his professional status in play overseas, is that something that might change in the near future?
No. And the reason for that is the membership. And remember, we're a membership organization. The national office, and I'm president of that membership organization, takes its marching orders from the members. The members have been very clear that professional activity, including signing a contract or, for example, getting an agent, prohibits you from participating. In cases of international athletes, European athletes, for example, who've signed a contract in the past, there are very set rules about what you can do and what you can't do and what the penalties are, and I really don't expect those to change. What I was talking about before is that someone was caught in the middle. The rules had changed, but in fact, there were some student athletes who were already attending college in the United States and were not given the benefit of the doubt.
Now, academics first is the emphasis, but there are some who say that's disingenuous in some respects because someone, a high school senior with an SAT score of 400, for example, can get in and get a scholarship at a university when there's, many would say, a small likelihood that they'll ever actually graduate.
Each institution sets its own admission standards, and each institution makes a prediction on what the qualifications of the incoming student would be, so he or she has the ability to graduate, the background and the native talent. The fact of the matter, there are some minimal standards that the NCAA puts in place, namely high school preparation for college, most especially core academic courses, that best prepare students for college. Those are, in fact, a better predictor, we believe, given all the data over long-term longitudinal studies of what's going to make for success in college. Each institution then applies its own admission standards on top of that. So Penn State, for example, has a higher admission standard than a number of other schools, and some school will take a student athlete or other students with a low SAT score. Penn State probably wouldn't do that. So we're only setting the floor, and each institution has the ability, and in fact does.
But is 400 too low a floor?
It depends how they've done in high school. It really does. And for some schools, under some programs, that might not be wrong. We're expecting a full course of study of high school academic courses and success in those. And that turns out to be a better predictor than how you do on a standardized test one afternoon.
In April, you're proposing that a program of incentives and disincentives, known as the academic progress rate, be adopted by the NCAA. Tell us something about that.
That's a very important question, a very important issue. Academic reform goes in cycles. We're about to have the peak, the culmination of the current cycle. This current cycle will end in holding teams and institutions accountable. We've already are holding student athletes accountable through initial eligibility, getting into college to play, and continuing eligibility so you can continue to play as you're making progress toward your degree. But now, for the first time, we're putting into place accountability measures for graduations at the team and school level. So, for example, if a team, a basketball, football, volleyball team, is not performing as well as the other students in the school, or is not performing as well as other teams in that institution, or nationally the same teams across the country, we'll first warn those institutions. If they don't pick it up, then we'll take away scholarships that they're permitted to give to student athletes. And if they still don't pick it up, we will take away the ability to play in postseason play, for example, in basketball in the Final Four. We'll also are considering decertifying the team. These are very strenuous rules and sanctions about what is acceptable for academic performance of athletic teams.
Now, you mentioned football and basketball, and according to NCAA figures, fewer than 50% of those on scholarships in those two sports actually do graduate.
It's a little better for football. The real problem area is men's basketball. It's very interesting to note that on average in all schools in Division I, student athletes graduate at 3 percentage points higher than the general student body. Women tend to graduate at higher rates than men, but by and large, the student athletes tend to do better. But there are serious exceptions. On average, football is slightly below the mean for the school in male graduates. That's not true at Penn State. Penn State's football graduation rate is sky high. Coach Paterno has done a great job in that regard. But I'm talking about the averages across all Division I schools. Men's basketball, on average, is an exception. And the graduation rates are well below the general student body and below what males graduate on those campuses.
Now, you said you're hoping that this will be adopted. What kind of buy-in do you need for this to pass?
I am optimistic that it'll pass. The presidents, who are the final decision makers here of Division I, have designed and signed off on this. The athletic directors have accepted it. It's gone through all the committee structure. We have one final vote in April. Now, you know, something can always go wrong, but the fact of the matter is I think we've been attentive to the needs. Now, there's another feature of this which is very important, and that is how we count graduation rates. The federal government, the way they mandate the counting, excludes transfers in and transfers out, and that's unfair to the schools. We're changing that as well. And so we will have our own graduation rate other than the federally mandated one which we've been using.
Now, universities profit from high-profile players in jersey sales, for example. We see in private industry, we see Xbox using maybe not the names, but the images and numbers of popular college players. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on players being able to profit from their own names and whether you think a scholarship is adequate compensation.
I think when they're student athletes, they must be student athletes. Pay for play will lead to the demise of college sports. You get tertiary professional sports at an institution rather than college students actually playing the game. Who would go to a Penn State game if they were low-level professionals playing with the team logo on their back, rented, and the studio, I should say the stadium rented? No one would go to a game like that. When you talk about this hot-button issue of names on jerseys and selling in bookstores, actually the amount of money there is very small. What it is really is a symbolic statement of whether student-athletes should be paid. And of course they shouldn't. What's wonderful about college sports is that the people representing the school out on the field are students. They're part of the university. Once you give that up, once you start to pay them, they become a labor force. And you begin to negotiate contracts. And then you might as well go see the pro teams play. Why would you want to see a college team play under those circumstances?
Talk, if you would, then about player benefits. What do you consider reasonable player benefits?
Right now we give what's called grants and aids. That is to say it covers tuition, room and board, and books, and a few others. Actually, that package tends to be less than the full cost of attendance by a couple $1,000s, $2,000 or $3,000 on average. I'm of the opinion that over time we should raise that to the full cost of attendance. Other students can work to make up that difference. Student athletes are under a great deal of time pressure. They can't possibly work. Those who come from wealthy families can make it up, but not all student athletes come from wealthy families. Now, Penn State actually does it right. They allow the student athlete to keep a Pell Grant, a federal grant for low-income families, or an academic scholarship, in addition to the grants and aids, up to the full cost of attendance. That's where I think the rest of the country has to go right now. But the limit is the full cost of attendance, what it really costs to go to school.
In the last two seasons, 2002, 2003, there were 12 regular season football games. This year, because of a blip in the calendar, there will only be 11. Of course, 12 was a financial boon to many institutions because of the revenue generated from those games. How likely is the NCAA to say 12 games every season? Well,
actually, it was a blip in a calendar that permitted the 12 games. Our normal number of games is 11.
Oh, okay. We got used to it, though.
But there were two, interestingly, back-to-back cases, and a number of schools have gotten used to the extra revenue. I met with the football leadership, the coaches, not long ago, and they are not in favor of a 12th game. They say, we're pretty tired. The student athletes are quite exhausted by the end of that, and then many of them go on to play bowl games in addition. The athletic directors, on the other hand, who have to make budget, would prefer a 12th game. So I think that debate is taking place right now. There's nothing concrete that says we're going to go to 12 games, but there is an argument that 11 games is plenty.
Speaking of debate, there is renewed debate about whether or not there should be a playoff system the way there is in basketball. The split championship between the USC Trojans and the LSU Tigers has lots of people saying that that's what we need. You have said, you've been on record with the commissioner of the BCS, that college presidents probably won't go for that.
Well, first of all, you have to understand who are the decision makers here. In postseason championship play, the NCAA oversees all those games in every sport, including football, with one exception. That's Division 1A football. In that case, the members, the presidents, have made that decision. They want to continue to control it, and they do it through the conferences. The 11 conferences that make up 1A are now debating what the postseason football should be like. So the presidents of those 11 conferences are the decision makers, not the BCS. Excuse me, not the NCAA. It's the BCS that is making that decision. And so I think we'll see what happens. I'm sure there'll be some changes. I don't believe there'll be an NFL-type football playoff or even anything close to resembling that. And the reason is that we talk a lot about over-commercialization. The fact of the matter, if we move to an NFL-type playoff or even anything resembling that, we will have increased for football that commercialization to the point it's not acceptable. Speaking
of LSU, which was one of those programs to hold the championship title, its coach, Nick Saban, had in his contract a clause that stipulated that he won the national championships, that he would earn at least a minimum of $1 more than the highest paid college football coach in the U.S. I'm wondering if you feel that that's an example of college coaches' salaries spiraling out of control, and just how concerned you are about that.
The market controls the compensation package for those coaches. Of course, not all that money comes from the universities. It comes from apparel contracts, TV contracts, speaking engagements, lots of other factors. But they're still very high compensation packages. A number of years ago, the NCAA wanted to try to control the cost of coaches' salaries. And so they brought down the cost of the compensation packages for assistant basketball coaches. The result of that was an antitrust suit, which the NCAA lost and had to pay $55 million. The fact of the matter is we have no control, and conferences have no control over setting the limit to salaries. Those coaches have become celebrities. That's what they can demand in the marketplace, and apparently some schools are willing to pay it.
When it comes to coaches, especially football coaches, you say that there are too few African-American head coaches, although there have been some moves. Last year, the Southeastern Conference hired a black coach and athletic director. You say, however, that it's a start, but more needs to be done.
Absolutely more needs to be done. There are only 5 head black football coaches out of 117 schools, and yet the players are far more prevalent than that. What we have to do, I believe, is make sure that the search process for new coaches, and I should say athletic directors and women coaches as well as African American coaches, we have to make sure that the search process is sufficient to allow the best talent to rise to the top. The problem is that when we have truncated search processes, when we have just a few people that are being interviewed and not a wide open, fair search.
Done deals probably in some cases.
Perhaps, and I think that leads to adverse selection, and the best talent doesn't always rise to the top.
What do you see in this coming year? You're at the start of a new year as the president of the NCAA, as goals and reforms that you'd like to see take shape?
I certainly want to finish the academic reform cycle we're in now, and the incentives, disincentives program that we talked about at the very beginning. That has to be completed. I'm going to continue to push for the integration of athletics into the academic mission of the institution, continue to work to make sure that student athletes are put at the center, and we treat them very fairly.
All right, thank you so much for being with us. We've been talking with Dr. Myles Brand. He is the president of the NCAA. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.